Our next speaker is Joshua Berman. He is Director of Business Development and Sales for the company iCAN. And today he's going to discuss the science revolution in Israel and more on the investments and with a look towards innovation and how things are progressing there. So with that, I'd like to ask, how did you get into the cannabis industry? And could you give us a little bit of your background?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having me. I sort of stumbled into the cannabis industry. I came to Israel about 20 years ago from Seattle and sort of had watched a lot of the development happening on the West Coast and other places in the States. I had a number of friends who were involved in the space, and I was sitting in Israel sort of, you know, certainly when you move here, you give up on certain things like the mountains, big snow. And cannabis, I thought, was one of those sort of opportunities I was saying no to, unbeknownst to me what was happening here locally. And so about 6 years ago, you know, one connection led to another. I think I was bemoaning the fact that things were happening in Seattle and it was all very exciting, and I was sitting here. And then sort of, you know, went down the rabbit hole and ended up, you know, realizing how much of the research and a lot of the innovation that was happening in the space even 5-6 years ago was really rooted in a lot of the work and science sort of on the shoulders of greats that had been doing it for many years here. And just got really excited and impassioned about the sort of the dosage and delivery validation, sort of all the pieces of the puzzle that seem to get brushed away quite a bit in the States, as an example, and have been, in the side ever since. So,
yeah, thank you, Joshua, and I also want to take a moment to thank you for being an advisory board member with GCNC as well. We appreciate all of the expertise that you bring to our network. And with that, could you tell us a little bit more about what is the role of iCAN and how you guys are operating?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so we started a number of years ago with CANNA Tech, which is a conference platform, as some people are familiar with and have been with us. Dr. Imbar has been with us many times over the years. And so for us, we focused in terms of the education and the content around there was really about showcasing science, bringing in the entrepreneurs and bringing the investors, sort of all three of those pillars together. We would host that event every year in Tel Aviv. And so we had sort of a unique conversation just because of a lot of the science, as you guys were hearing about before, that would get showcased and brought in our Tel Aviv event. But then we would sort of take that conversation, you know, into different emerging markets. We stayed out of North America by and large because there's lots of other conversations happening, but we would move into places like we did an event in Sydney and Panama and in Hong Kong and Cape Town. We would just sort of go to all these different markets and really get to know and interact with the professionals that were, you know, pushing those the cannabis agenda forward in those regions, and bring a lot of knowledge from the U.S., from Israel, from other existing places to help, you know, these folks really move consciously forward in the space. As a company, it's a great way to interact with lots of wonderful people, you know, leaders of companies and investors from around the world. And then we essentially, for us, that was a funnel. So we built out trying to find other ways to leverage those networks. We built an incubator or an accelerator. So we have a number of companies where we give support and help them build out and connect to this international ecosystem that we've created, which is really fitting, and do the same for companies that are looking to enter, you know, different regions and different spaces, in a nutshell.
Gotcha. So with that, you know, we just heard from Inbar about what's happening in the realm of scientific research in Israel. And from your perspective, I would love if you could tell us about what it means for Israel that, you know, it's federally legal and the opportunities presented by federal funding for research, and how the environment that's made possible because of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's unique I think it's unique to Israel to some degree. Certainly, the support of innovation is unique. So the government here, and something Inbar touched on a little bit in terms of the different stages of companies, but certainly for the startup and pre-revenue companies here in Israel, there's opportunities for federal funding, right? Unlike the U.S., because we're a federally regulated program, both in terms of clinical trials on one hand, where you want to, work with the hospitals, work with the doctors, work with the patients. There's really no impediment to moving those kinds of projects forward. In the same regard, the same benefits the government awards to other industries in terms of funding for innovative ideas and innovative concepts is perfectly valid inside the cannabis space. So there's opportunities for funding anywhere from 90% of an initiative, let's say, if you're looking to do some kind of research. Certainly, if you team up with universities, we have the Volcani Institute, which is sort of the government, the agricultural arm of the government, and they're just wonderful scientists and people doing work there. And you can sort of team up with the scientists in the field that you're interested in and find ways to sort of bring together funding, much of which will come from the government to help support those initiatives, which is just very different than everything I hear from in the States, as an example.
Right, exactly. I know since you spent time in the States, you're familiar with how everything works here. But from my perspective as an American, it was incredible to hear Inbar touch on how many universities are doing government-funded research at universities on cannabis, which is just such a complete opposite kind of thing from our experience here in the United States.
Absolutely. I mean, to that point, we're not a large country, right? So it's 6 hours north to south, 45 minutes east to west. So you have, and probably half of it is actually where people live. The other half is desert. So not only do you have all these universities and all of these institutions that are studying campus, but just physically close to each other. So there are stories of clinical trials where something ran amok, or there was a change in behavior of some of the patients that were using cannabis. And it took a few minutes or whatever the short period of time was for the head of the research, the hospital, the cultivator, all of these people to team together to sort of break down what was going on, versus just expansive space between places. Or if one company is building a new innovative idea here, it's only 20 minutes to get to the next place where they can sort of take it to the next level. It's not, it's just it's really a unique setting for an ecosystem to build on itself.
Mm-hmm. Right. So grateful for that ecosystem in terms of the leading role that Israel plays in the research in cannabis space currently. So let's talk about some of the things that, what are the opportunities for foreign investors who want to be involved in the cannabis landscape in Israel? What does that look like these days? And what might it look like?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, and Inbar should have definitely touched on that side because of our finance side. But I think, there are a lot of early stage companies, more so than we have, as time goes on, some of these companies have become really well established and have significant revenues. And then you're sort of investing into something a little bit more known. But there is a unique opportunity here to really dig into some of these really innovative concepts, to invest and support these early stage companies to get to the next level, whether that's on clinical trials, whether that's on, development on the ag tech side or where else. But there are certainly opportunities. It is young. They are generally younger companies, like you've seen in Canada before, all these publicly traded sort of vehicles for raising capital. We have a number of companies here that sort of jumped into the public markets as well. But so that's always an opportunity. But I think the early stage companies where the exciting stuff happens.
Mm. So I would like to shift a little bit into some of the cultivation topics. And one thing that we had discussed a little bit earlier was pricing for patients and how that's being regulated and how is that accessible for patients. So could you give us a brief overview of what the patient experience is in Israel and some of the issues around pricing?
Yeah, I mean, so we've been in a bit of a transition. So we had a system initially where it was state controlled in terms of the pricing. So cultivators weren't actually being reimbursed, but they were told how much they were able to charge a patient. So historically, a patient would pay essentially $100, basically $100 a month, and receive whatever their prescription was allotted. So it could be 20, 40, 60, even back then, if you were very sick, you could get up to 100 grams per month, all for that $100. And then at that time, we had only 8 vertical grows, and you were essentially signed. Once you got your prescription, you were essentially assigned to one of those cultivators, and then you received your flower, which is all that it was, which was flower from that grow. And eventually, what happened is the latest regulations broke apart that vertical integration into different stepping stones, from cultivation to processing and so on. And they, more importantly, took the flower and put it into the pharmacies, which is where it is today. And so rather than being assigned to a specific cultivator, you now go with your prescription to the pharmacy, and you get to pick and choose between these different variations of essentially THC and CBD. But it also broke the pricing. So even though today our pricing on the global market, I think today patients pay, let's call it 30 shekels, call it $10 a gram, more or less, which is relatively, good in sort of what's happening in the world. Here, patients are really fighting back against the system because of what was before, and that, we're also a socialized medical system. And so, like I saw, I believe in Australia already it's happening, and in Canada it's happening, where the HMOs are essentially contributing as you do for other prescriptions. Again, this is a prescription. Today it's a prescription like anything else, and it's subsidized through these HMO programs here locally. So they want the cannabis to be in the same position, and so there's this push and this pushback from the government, and the patients are definitely fighting their way forward. It'll be interesting to see what happens. We have, for better for worse, there's about 7 tons, I think, of flour that's come into Israel over the last year from Canada and other places, and that also begins to play with the pricing of what's happening, because it's just not all locally generated. So it's a bit of a mess, but it's gotten better for the patient. As Inbar had mentioned, we're now at 70,000 patients. We were at, I think when I started, let's say 6 years ago, we were probably at 35, 40, and it's really only over the last year that we've had this nice big jump, and they expect us to, be at 100,000 by a few months away. So we'll see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But hopefully access is increasing is the most important part.
Yeah. Do you see the impacts of the COVID pandemic having any impact on that? Has that highlighted any particular challenges? Or
I don't have a card as a patient, so I know that there was trouble receiving flour, just in terms of making sure what you wanted was there. But from spoken with some friends who run the processing and the manufacturing, or at least the taking of flour into the bags and the processing part, and they've always been considered an essential business, but even those essential businesses had to have specific numbers of people in the manufacturing at any one time. And so it was very difficult for all of those companies to be putting flour into the market. But here, even with and we had some pretty serious lockdowns for a good number of weeks or a month or whatever it was. But pharmacies obviously never closed. So that access point was never turned off. We didn't have, again, from Seattle, we didn't have essential services like dispensaries, and it was just part of the pharmacy network. That was never turned off. Mm-hmm.
It has been, as a little bit of a side note, it's been interesting to see in the States when cannabis dispensaries have been deemed as essential or non-essential businesses. I spent time in Colorado at the beginning of the pandemic, and right now I'm in Washington State. And for a moment, the Colorado governor was not going to deem cannabis dispensaries as essential. And I have never seen such long lines for anything in my life.
Amy, how many, from your, just because it's a really interesting point. I mean, how many of the states were essential versus, I mean, not exact numbers, but were most states cannabis essential, or that was a sort of a California, Colorado, Washington thing?
I couldn't tell you for absolutely sure, but I do think where they were legalized by the states, they were deemed essential businesses. Even medical, of course, like to your point, the pharmacies didn't close, so there was still medical access. But in the states where recreational was legal, I believe they have still been considered essential businesses in the same way as liquor stores. So that's such an interesting cultural aspect that we are dealing with, where it is federally illegal, but in states where it's recreational available for adult use, it's still deemed essential.
I know they tried in Cape Town to close the liquor stores. That didn't go over very well either. So
yeah, exactly. What other impacts have you seen the COVID pandemic have on the cannabis business and industry in Israel? What can you tell us?
I mean, I think in general, due to COVID, and certainly for us as a conference organization, these Zoom gatherings are fabulous, but not exactly the same as bringing hundreds of people together. So that's a big thing. We've done a lot more of these kinds of interactions and tried to create more networking opportunities beyond content, which is a great way to bring people together. So that's been a big issue. I think also on the funding side, there was a time where everyone was sort of waiting to see how all of this was going to pan out. And there's been, it seems right, and I'd love to hear Inbar's opinion, but in general, I feel like over the last few weeks to a month, there's been a real energy boost in terms of people that were once looking for investment, finding those investors, and things sort of turning back on as everything sort of seems to, everyone understands this ebb and flow that seems to be coming with COVID. Again, U.S. is a little bit different because just it's all crazy over there at the moment. But yeah, I think things have sort of picked up a little bit on that side, at least here.
So let's shift a little bit to talk about the future and what's coming next out of Israel. I'm curious to know what trends in product development like you are most excited about. What are you seeing, and what gets you most excited about in terms of being able to fill some needs that patients have?
Yeah, I mean, number one, I definitely want to hear, and sorry to keep harping on Inbar, but we've been talking about Israel so much. I want to hear about her encapsulation technology. But to that point, there's just a lot, whether it's on sort of the nano emulsification and encapsulation. We have a company inside our incubator called the iCAN, which is an ocular delivery. And just to give an example, that the ocular delivery, we've licensed technology from Technion, which is one of these sort of like MIT big institutions, which allows us to sort of build out this. It's essentially a driver for the cannabinoid molecules into the eye, and it's just that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what companies are looking to build much more precise and directed personalized medicine. And I think that there's a lot on the wellness side that's really interesting. There are companies now working on waste solutions for cannabis, which I think can be really interesting. And obviously, as we heard about before, the CRISPR technology coming into the agro side. So I just think on all, Israel sort of this coming together, we've had a very successful biotech sector as well as an agrotech sector. So this cannabis is kind of just stands in both sides of those ecosystems, which were very well developed before we started to talk about cannabinoids. And so now, as years go on and people who are very well experienced in either one of those arenas really begins to enter this space, and we're just going to begin to see more and more exciting activities.
Yeah, so I hadn't heard anybody previously bring up waste solutions that you touched on. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Well, I think there's a big issue around the waste in general. I know here locally, they essentially initially wanted to burn it as a solution, and then our equivalent of the EPA basically said you can't burn it. They're basically stuck with keeping it inside their secured fencing with really no solution. And then the one that the government put out included, pouring bleach or whatever kind of solvent onto it, and then hoarding it down to a bio incinerator down in the south. I mean, just incredibly costly and a problematic solution. So first and foremost, even if we talk about composting here, or a simple thing that, I had spoke with a friend in Arizona. She said they just composted it, put it back into the ground. But here locally, if we want to do anything with that waste product, we're going to first need to figure out how to, essentially get rid of any of the active ingredients, which can be a whole process. So there's people looking at composting, fungal options. I just think it'll be really interesting to see what comes out of that. And then once the companies themselves can break down those active compounds, then it just becomes waste. And there's all sorts of cool stuff you can do with waste. So that's a whole nother thing.
Right, and an area ripe for innovation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Which does lead me to ask you a little bit about the role of hemp in Israel and what's happening there. Is it more on the CBD side, or is there still a role for industrial hemp?
I mean, so to be honest, we have no role for hemp locally. At the moment, it's essentially under the same umbrella as medical cannabis, so it's regulated in the same way as a dangerous ingredient, I guess you'd call it, for anything that's a cannabinoid, right? There's really no much difference between hemp and cannabis other than the THC. So all of it's under one rubric. There is a push in the government to separate out CBD or hemp in particular from the medical cannabis stuff that we have. We'll see if that happens. We don't have much hemp cultivation here, even for research. There's a little bit happening. There are high CBD and very low THC strains that patients can have access to, but they're coming from full spectrum cannabis. They're not coming from a hemp derived, again, just because of legality. So, there's stuff around that people have figured out how to bring in, but by and large, there's really no market. And once that changes, it'll be really interesting. I think Israelis, from a wellness perspective, will get very excited. And I can say that some of the institutions here are, from a research and innovation side, have been working on whether it's things like Hempcrete and others, have some really interesting IP out there in the world. And we'll have to see when we can grow the hemp to actually utilize the exciting innovation that they have going on.
Yeah, still so much opportunity there, and still opportunity for doing more good in the world, because there's such sustainable benefits to working with hemp even more.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I'm just keeping my eye on time, and we're just about to shift into our Q&A session. So I just want to check, we've covered so many interesting topics with you. Is there any, one point that you would want to leave us with about what's most exciting to you in Israel, or just what you think people should know about the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to the innovation. I think it's the environment, it's the ecosystem that companies and individuals here are trying to think out of the box. We are a very westernized country in sort of a different neighborhood. And so when we look to, as Israel does, businesses don't tend to stay here locally very long. They look at the globe. And so we sort of are very involved and very knowledgeable what's happening in the States, but outside, and really looking for new opportunities and new places to put that innovation. And there are some wonderful companies here just beginning that are looking at new ways to bring medicine to the people.
Thank you so much, Josh. So let's check in to see if there were any questions from the audience. Maybe Denise will let us know.
Yes, we have a question, but the person that's going to ask the question had to jump off really quick. So I have a question as far as the types of businesses that you're looking to partner up with. Could you explain what's an ideal type of business?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'll speak beyond even myself, but for companies that are here, they're looking for companies that they can partner, almost like a launch pad, into the U.S. Obviously or into Canada, or wherever they're going. It's difficult to set that up from here. So a lot of companies have, maybe the innovation arm is located here, but as they begin to expand, they create joint ventures and things with local parties in the States to bring the technology, whether it's, as Inbar was talking about, IP transfer, all of that. If you have one foot inside the other company, it's a little bit easier to do. But I think it's just about expanding the network and getting access, depending on what you're doing, access to the farms or to the patients or to the distribution networks.
Okay, great. And there is a question, in Israel, what's been the approach with the shift to virtual conferences versus in-person events? How are you handling all of that?
Lots of virtual events. I'd say, locally there's yet to be, we still are confined by pretty strict rules. So even the hybrid model, which I think is really interesting to watch, certainly as the director of CannaTech, if we can figure out ways to put people together. We've tried to do it where we had essentially little pods, like 20 people here in this state and another 20 in another state and different. But that hasn't worked out for us so much, because locally we've been stuck to literally 20 people as a maximum gathering. And so we've been doing the virtual events. And they've been great. I mean, I think whether it's a long form event like we're doing here, or whether it's the webinars, it's really about getting people together, access to networking, and learning. So
that's fantastic. So Tasha, do you have a question that you'd like to ask?
Yes, I do. Sorry, I was struggling to get my mute off.
Hey, Tasha.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Likewise.
I'm going to try to close these blinds real quick.
What do we need to know about imports to Israel?
It's a shifting thing. We historically were accepting GACP flower, essentially. So a lot of the Canadian growers were able to do that. They've voiced, and so then you just need a partner here, whether that's one of the cultivators or a standalone person who has the licensing to bring in. That has shifted a little bit. They've voiced more like Germany, that in Israel they want to have EU GMP as the standard for the flower that comes into the country. That isn't law to date, and we'll just sort of have to see. I've spoken to a few of the importers who are waiting for their final, stamp of approval on some GACP flower, and it just hasn't come. That could be a COVID situation, that the regulator is just moving slowly, or they've really begun to enforce a GMP equivalent kind of thing to bring in. But there is a hunger amongst the cultivation for flower, for sure.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, all of the panels today have echoed that very same thing in every country that we've spoken to at this point. So, I mean, again, just the same message being reiterated over and over again. I think there is, I want to say, urgency, or it's a priority for many people around the world.
Absolutely.
There's certainly,
but I think the standards. Yeah, no, and I think that we'll start to see, as more countries raise the bar in terms of standards, you're gonna, the default is always going to be, which is already a real level, which is the GAP, but you're gonna see more countries, certainly the medicalized countries, and again, Israel may go rec, but in the meantime, you'll see the medicalized countries push for the GMP.
And then what was that, Jill? Sorry.
Oh, I was just agreeing, remarking about the cohesion that we're seeing with everybody calling for the same thing. So regulators, absolutely, hurry up and keep moving.
Everyone else is on the
absolutely.
same.
Joshua, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. We understand it's late your time, and that you could be doing a lot of things on a Saturday, and appreciate you joining.
It. No, it was great fun. Thank you very much.
It was nice to meet you.
Nice
Thank you,
meeting you.
Josh.
Take care,
Great to
guys.
see you.
Thank you.